Alright, good afternoon everyone. Very welcome on the second day of Drupal Camp Belgium. I have a few quick announcements before we start with the keynote. First of all, the open source Drupal training session has been moved to 16:20. The schedule has been updated on the website. Second, there's a missing Fitbit still in the box. If you should come across a Fitbit still in the box, please bring it to the reception or back to the level 27 stand. Then the future of Drupal Camp and the Drupal user group in general. For those who were here yesterday as well, we're really starting to kick it in a second gear for the marketing of Drupal in Belgium, marketing of the Drupal brand. And we are looking for companies to sponsor us, and we are looking for an independent digital marketeer to help us, because we're all techies, to help us with the marketing, inbound, outbound marketing. If you know someone, please let them contact us. Is the Fitbit back?
Fitbit is okay.
The Fitbit is back.
Oh,
incredible.
Best news all day.
Fantastic. And this year is a record edition for Drupal Camp Belgium. Never before has there been so many people attending, so many people sharing their Drupal knowledge in Belgium, so that's awesome. 173% increase.
Wow.
And for next year, we of course also want to organize a new edition, and we're always looking for extra hands to help in a Belgian city to organize the next Drupal Camp. So if you want to help out, or if you want to bring Drupal Camp to your city, please come visit us at the reception and then let's have a talk. Now, these Drupal camps are only made possible thanks to our many sponsors, which give much needed financial aid to make all of this possible. One of the sponsors is Level 27, and I would like to give Peter a minute to talk about it.
Hi guys, I'm Peter from Level 27. I have a question. How many of you do actually know us? Oh, that's great. That's why we're here. So our baseline is hosting better. It means we're trying to make hosting better. We don't deliver only hosting, but we try to help you with many, many more. So are you interested? Please don't hesitate to visit our stand. If you're not interested, please visit the stand too, because we're organizing a small game. You can win a Fitbit, which has been found. For now, I'm going to give the word to Preston So. He's going to talk about the future, how Drupal will look like in 6 years. So please, your attention for the Drupal frontend in 2024.
Woo! Dankjewel. Oh, the button is pressed. The Fitbit is found. Okay, test. Oh. Test. Okay, there we go. Goedemiddag. Gaat het met u? Goed? Hartelijk welkom. Ik ben Preston. Ik ben de directeur van onderzoek en innovatie bij Acquia. En het is een groot plezier met iedereen hier in Gent te zijn. I'm also part of the Acquia Labs team. Once again, good afternoon. Sorry, in het Engels. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here in Gent today, here at Hogeschool Gent. And I'm the Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia. I also run our Acquia Labs innovation team. So if you are looking for anything related to some of the emerging technologies that are currently impacting the landscape, and you need a partner to work on those sorts of things with you, please let me know. I just have a couple of things to say before I begin. First is, I just finished a book. If you are interested in decoupled Drupal, or if you are interested in anything related to headless solutions, API first, JavaScript, all of those sorts of things, this book is available right now for pre-order, and that will be available very soon. Also, one of the conferences that, or the conference that I organize, Decoupled Drupal Days, we had a successful second year in August of this year, and next year we'll be doing it again, most likely in either June or July of 2019. Please follow at Decoupled Days on Twitter to keep up to date on all the new developments. It's going to be very interesting. Okay, so today this keynote is meant to be something that is an exploration of some of the aspirational things that we might want to do with Drupal. And it's an assessment also of the current state of Drupal and where we are today. And for those of you watching the recording, I have with me right now a microphone from the year 2024. As you can see, it's designed very specifically for this use. And it's actually a headset. I just don't want to wear the headset. So anyways, I want to cover a couple of different things today. And some of you may have seen a little bit of this content before. I have talked about these issues in the past. But I consider this talk to be the most refined state of a lot of the things that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years. The first thing I want to do is to take us back in time. And I want to do this because I want us to look at how Drupal was and how the Drupal front end in particular was 6 years ago, how it is today, and how it might be 6 years from now. But I also want to talk about some of the problems that face Drupal today in terms of having that successful future of the front end before us. And I want to talk about two different types of editing and the ways in which we want to look at the way that Drupal will change for editors in the future. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the front end future and what exactly will happen to Drupal in the long run with some of these decisions that we make in the near future. But first, before I begin, how many people in here are developers? Okay. How many people are more on the marketing side, site builders or content writers, copy editors? Okay. How about people who are designers in the room? Okay, UX specialists? Great. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a section about a brief history lesson. And this is something that if you've seen my keynote at Drupal Camp Spain or also at Drupal South, this will be very familiar. So I'll move very quickly through this. But I think it's very educational for us to go all the way back to the beginning of Drupal's history. Drupal started out, of course, with drop.org. And this was back in the year 2000 when the web was very limited to pages on the browser. And the ways in which people built websites back then, of course, was to use FTP, upload things to a server, and show that website in the browser. But the thing that really distinguished this era of Web 1.0 was the fact that it was primarily about text and images. You had occasional images that were spread throughout the text. You also had the interactions that were led by the keyboard and the mouse. There was no difference between how you would use a website back then and today, of course. We still use the website in much the same way. In 2002, we had the release of Drupal 4, which is the beginning of the more kind of, sort of more bluish interface. We see a lot more of Drupal's character begin to be shown. In Drupal 6 in 2008, we begin to have a lot of the things and features that we know today very well. CCK, views, also things like panels began to emerge, things like layout building, layout management, and some of the ideas that became very influential over the course of Drupal's front end over the last several years really became popular in 2008. In 2012, we also had an initiative in Drupal known as Spark. And this was an initiative more on the administrative side. We wanted to look at how can we make the editorial interface of Drupal something that is pleasant not only on the web, not only on the browser, but also on a mobile device and also on your tablet. And so part of that effort was to look at mobile-first applications and how we can take some of these editorial interfaces and make them more responsive and also make them more mobile-friendly. And what we know about mobile devices is that people use mobile devices very differently from the way that they use browsers on a computer. You generally use gestures to interact with this. You use pinch and zoom, you swipe, things of that nature. You have mostly text and images spread across the entire page, the entire viewport, rather than being solely small parts of the page. Also in 2012, that was a very big banner year for Drupal because the first Drupal iOS SDK was released. And this was a very big step for Drupal because this was something that you could do for the very first time. You could build native applications based on Drupal using things like the services module, and you could also build any applications that you could imagine based on the fact that you could now communicate with Drupal from outside of Drupal. And you could make things happen with Drupal without actually ever touching Drupal at all. Today, over the last few years, we've seen an explosion of new technologies emerge on the market, things like wearables. And as you can imagine, one of the big problems with things like the Apple Watch is that today you can now browse websites on the Apple Watch. But there's really limited real estate. You don't have a lot of space to actually use a website. So how do we think about what Drupal content looks like on an Apple Watch? How do we look at Drupal websites on an Apple Watch? And how do we actually think about designing for these wearable technologies? We also now have digital signage. One of the very first examples of this is the University of Iowa in the United States, which instituted a large campus signage program all throughout campus that was based on Drupal and allowed for the delivery of content to various screens and kiosks and different locations on campus. Once again, another very interesting application of Drupal, but again, even further away from the website, because now we're not thinking about text and images. We're thinking about signs and messages that tend to be very large and have to be legible to a large audience. And so this kind of emergence of these ideas has really changed the way that Drupal operates. Of course, now we have things like Drupal serving Roku, Drupal serving Samsung TV, Apple TV. There was a very interesting session I attended last year in São Paulo in Brazil about how we can actually leverage Drupal for these over-the-top or TV applications. But, of course, the other issue with this is that now we're integrating more with these technologies that have very limited capabilities for design, that have very limited flexibility in terms of the user experience. And how does that change the way that we consider content in Drupal? Finally, we also have things like augmented reality, for example, where you can now get information, get content delivered in the context of what you're looking at. And this is very different, once again, also from the way that we expect a website to work. One demo that we completed within the Acquia Labs team about a year ago was focused on how the shopping experience, for example, in a grocery store could be really reinvented by using augmented reality for delivering content. And of course, now finally we have conversational interfaces. And last year, we also released Ask Georgia Gov, which is the first ever Alexa skill for citizens of that state in the United States. And it's very interesting because we actually have a little bit of information that I'm going to share with you in this session about what exactly content means in that environment. So overall, the reason I wanted to start with that brief history lesson is we've come a long way from Drupal being drop.org, from being solely limited to those websites. And today, if you think about Drupal, not only is Drupal of legal age, it can drink, but also the fact that it's delivering these experiences to many different places is a big, big step for our community. But when you think about it, we're talking about content here. We're not just talking about Drupal. We're talking about content. How exactly does the notion of content and the concept of content evolve over the course of the next few years? And so my question today, and my mission today, is to, as someone from the future in 2024, is to ask all of you to think about what can we do to prepare Drupal, and what can we do to prepare ourselves for what's next, because we have no idea what could be coming in the future. Because how do we prepare for a future where the front end is completely uncertain? We might have something like a new version of JavaScript that doesn't bear any resemblance to JavaScript at all. Oh, that's TypeScript. I'm sorry, no, just kidding. But, just kidding. TypeScript is actually great. But there are other languages that will emerge in the future. We know this already. We've seen technologies like Elm emerge in the last couple of years. We've seen examples like ClojureScript. These are all technologies that are moving past JavaScript already as that front-end development focus. So let's go back in time again to 6 years ago. Because one of the things that I want to talk about is how did some of the ideas that transpired in Drupal 6 years ago impact some of the ways that we're building interfaces and sites in Drupal today? The good news is that in 2012, the world didn't end, thank goodness. And in 2012, we actually had very few channels, right? We only had web, we had mobile, maybe an iPad, but there was nothing really different about that whole landscape. You would still use websites in much the same way, but there were a couple of big things that happened. First of all, we had the destruction of entire cities, as you can see, but that actually didn't come to pass. That was all, we were all lucky to make it out. But in 2012, we had websites and we had the notion of responsive design, and I'll return to responsive design shortly. But if you think about this, what happened afterwards is quite interesting to think about. Back in that era, we had a theming engine, a template engine known as PHP template. How many people know about PHP template and Smarty? And okay, great. So I'm dealing with an audience here who knows about this stuff. The thing about PHP template and the thing about the ways in which we built the theme layer in Drupal, it was really focused on the way that we wanted to provide a theming experience. We had this separate persona that was distinct from the editor, distinct from the developer, that was right in the middle between those two, the themer. And this is a very interesting new time because at that time, a lot of these ideas revolved around how can we make the friction for these front-end themers actually less severe? How can we de-emphasize custom front-end development? How can we move away from the fact that you need to actually know a lot of PHP or know a lot of HTML, know a lot of CSS to be able to write a Drupal front-end? But the problem is that now, over the course of time, over the last 6 years, we've seen people start to do much more experimental things. And as we know, developers are always running ahead of everybody else. And they are using things like jQuery and Ajax to build new small-scale interactions, new small-scale widgets on the page. But as you can see, these solutions begin to show a little bit of that inflexibility, right? Because the whole question began to emerge. How do we deal with asset libraries within the Drupal front end? We now have an answer, of course, in Drupal 8. In responsive design, one of the things that came up from responsive design is this quote, which I really like. Content is like water, right? The whole idea of responsive design is that we can think of content as something like a liquid, and wherever we pour it, it adapts to the shape of that content. And this image is actually very instructive, because if you think about this water, it's just a piece of content, but regardless of whether it's in the glass or on the table, it still has the same kind of information that it's passing through. It's just the shape that it's in, the context of the content that is changing. So all of this to say is that in 2012 with responsive design, we saw the beginnings of this notion, which I want to return to once again and again over the course of this talk, which is that content shouldn't actually be content specific. We shouldn't be building content that's mobile only or mobile friendly. We shouldn't be building content that's web only or web friendly. We should be making content and writing content that is adaptable to any context, just like that glass of water. We need to be able to place that content anywhere that it appears, and it shouldn't be something that is coupled to the context itself. Now let's fast forward again 6 years to today. One of the things that is very interesting for me as a biology student when I was in high school was the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion happened a very long time ago in the fossil record, and this is where my biology teacher will be mad at me because I don't remember the exact year. But the Cambrian explosion was a seminal event in Earth's history. And the reason why is because it actually led to a proliferation of new life forms. And as a matter of fact, the vast majority of life that is existing today on the planet came from this single event in the fossil record where you had this diversification of life forms from one-celled organisms into multicellular organisms and so on and so forth. And this is very similar to what we're experiencing today. As we know, back in 2012, we only had to deal with websites and responsive design, and a lot of these ideas around mobile really didn't begin to emerge until about 5 years ago. But now, today, as I just showed in that first section of this talk, we now have all of these other channels that we have to deal with. Our customers today are expecting that we can deliver content by voice. They expect today that we can also deliver content to digital signs, to TVs, to chatbots, to AR/VR interfaces, and so on and so forth. And if you haven't had a request from a client yet about this, you will soon, I guarantee it. There will be a need for you to deliver that content to other places in addition to just the website. But one thing that we know about Drupal is that developers are always challenging Drupal by pushing the limits of what exists today, by pushing the envelope of what's possible today. And we know that no matter what we do, there will always be somebody interested in building these things for these new interfaces. One good example, of course, is the fact that we now have a variety of modules available in Drupal that interact with things like Alexa or A-Frame or other VR interfaces as well. But the thing is now, today, if we look back at 6 years ago and compare it to today, front-end tooling looks completely different. We now have the development of front-end ops, or the notion that you have a build workflow within your front-end environment, within your front-end development workflows. For example, we now have package managers like NPM, Yarn. We have a variety of different tools now that we use in JavaScript and also in the front end in Drupal itself. And Node.js and Universal JavaScript have really changed the way that JavaScript now works today. And we know this because of the fact that we see a lot of different applications that are being built, and a lot of different server-side applications in particular that are being built. It's a big shift in how we operate. And we know also that people want to do things like this, server-side JavaScript, where you can actually have a rendering of your front end happen within the JavaScript server, the Node.js server, and then serve that out as the initial state of your application. And this was a very big event in Drupal's history, because one of the things that happened was we had, for example, this idea of having Node.js serve all of these things and controlling the entire rendering process. And we only use Drupal now for data. And we only use Drupal as that repository for data to get information out and to update what happens on the front end. So the thing is, though, one of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of years especially is the fact that we are talking about JavaScript a lot of the times as if it's part of our existing environment, as part of our existing front end that we have in Drupal. But if you think about the fact that today many people are moving towards this environment, towards this kind of new landscape of server-side JavaScript and universal JavaScript, you know for a fact that they're not even thinking about using Drupal at all for the front end. And we actually have a concept known as progressive decoupling in Drupal that allows us to go in that direction. But the thing is, if you think about things like Angular, React, Ember, these frameworks, JavaScript, as a matter of fact, is really just another channel. And we should treat it just like it is another channel. And we shouldn't treat it as something that is, let's say, the same as our existing Drupal front end. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a little bit. So let's talk briefly about progressive decoupling, because this is a topic that has come up very often over the last couple of years. It's a term that was coined by Dries about 3 years ago. And it's this idea that we can interpolate the JavaScript framework into an existing Drupal front end. But there's a couple of problems with this approach. And we know that one of the things that it aids is that nice interactivity that people want, that our customers want today on a daily basis. But of course, the issue with this is that it gets rid of certain functionality in Drupal, or it makes certain things in Drupal much more complicated. And we know this for a fact. But the difference here between using this approach, of course, also, is that we actually don't have access to the server-side rendering process that made JavaScript so popular for those solutions. And we know also that many people have been doing this kind of approach in a variety of different ways, where you can put certain areas of the page and transform that page into parts that are JavaScript and parts that are PHP rendered. But here's the problem with this, and this is the fundamental issue that I raised about this very approach back in DrupalCon Vienna about a year ago, which is that fundamentally, when you think about this whole approach, it turns these blocks, these areas of the page that we want to make more dynamic and more interactive, into black boxes. And these black boxes make it so that a lot of the things that people have been used to for such a long time are actually no longer available, such as in-place editing, which is a very important feature of Drupal today. So this is to say that one of the biggest issues with progressive decoupling is this very notion that we don't have the ability now to consider what this can do for editors. We don't have the ability to give editors the same experience that they've had for this entire time. And one thing that we know about editors today is that they've become more and more demanding, and they become more and more rigorous in the things that they want out of an experience like Drupal, out of that administrative experience not only, but also the tools that they use on the page. But this developer-focused mindset that has led to progressive decoupling, has led to this proliferation of approaches, has also expanded to other channels. And that's a very good thing, because we see this exploration happening more and more. So next I want to talk very briefly about what 6 years from now could look like, by which I mean to say I have absolutely no clue. And so that title is a complete misnomer, because there is no way that we can predict what the front end will look like in 6 years. But one thing I know for sure is that this will definitely become real life. How many people have seen Minority Report? Yes. You know, I'm a huge science fiction movie fan. And this movie, along with The Matrix, are the two movies that have held up really well over the last 20 years. You know, all those other, a lot of the other sci-fi movies have really kind of not really held up so well, like Hackers. You know, some of these films are really, you watch them today and you think, how could this ever pass a Hollywood boardroom today? But one of the things that I love about Minority Report is that it shows an amazing array of different user experiences, an amazing range of different types of interfaces that people can use. One of which, of course, is this crazy gestural interface that is used to identify people and also to actually make these. I'm not going to spoil too much of the movie, but check out the movie if you haven't seen it. But the thing is, we know for a fact that a lot of these new interfaces that are emerging today will become part of this amazing future that we've begun to see emerge on the landscape. One example of this is the fact that over the course of the last year or two, we've seen a lot of work in the area of sublingual interactions or sublingual interfaces, where there's research that shows that it's very possible to take a little chip, insert it underneath your tongue, and then based on the synapses that are traveling to your tongue, you can actually make voice interactions happen without having to say anything, because of when you actually think a sentence, that is triggering some of the neurons within your tongue. And so this kind of technology will become a part of our future in the next 10 to 20 years. But there's also things like haptic interfaces, right, which are adhering to this idea that based on the bodily functions that we have, based on the sensory interactions that we have, we can actually perform different kinds of interactions as well. And what does content look like in that environment, right? How can we think about when a future happens when someone has an eye implanted and content is displayed right there within their vision? This is a very kind of, way far in the future idea, but I guarantee you that we'll begin to see some of these kinds of ideas emerge within the next 6 years. So what will Drupal look like in 2024? And what will Drupal actually become in 6 years? We have some ideas today of what will happen, thanks to especially the works of the Admin UI and JavaScript Modernization Initiative. We also have a lot of ideas that are coming from our designers and our creatives within the Drupal community. But we don't really know what Drupal should look like in 2024. And I guess that's the real question we should be asking, is what should it look like in 2024? We know that for a fact, Drupal will have a much more modern and interactive administrative interface thanks to the efforts of the Admin UI initiative. And it will be something that people will use that is not necessarily the same as what we have today. But we also know that our clients 6 years from now are going to want even more flexibility. They want to have even more control and even more of these rich interfaces that help them to edit content and create these new experiences that they want and deliver content to these new channels. But the thing is, we can't predict how those workflows will look. And this is the fundamental problem today with how we want to prepare Drupal's front end for that future. We don't know exactly how those front end workflows will look. Just as we didn't predict, for example, the fact that we would have all of these new build workflows happening within the front end 6 years ago. But we know that there will be many more channels to deal with, not just JavaScript, not just some of these channels that I've talked about today, like digital signs and kiosks and so forth. There will be many more of these kinds of channels that will emerge on the market. So I want to talk now about a couple of problems that we have to face. And these are things that are very challenging to talk about, but they are things that we must consider as we look at how do we want the front end to evolve in Drupal. One of the things that I asked last year, about 1 year ago in Vienna, was the fact that we now have this problem of 3 personas within Drupal. And the problem with these 3 personas is that they all want different things. And Drupal's benefit, Drupal's primary advantage has always been that we're right in the middle of these 3 different personas. And I asked a year ago, is this irreconcilable? Can we have the ability to have a single technology like Drupal provide a solution for all 3 of these personas? Is it actually a possibility? Because one of the things that we know, and this is very important to the current state of Drupal, is that right now, if you're an editor and you want to do things like preview, like layout management, you want to do things like in-place editing, and look at these contextual tools that we have now in the Drupal front end today in Drupal 8, those work on only 2 of these kinds of ideas. And that limits the ability for those marketing professionals to actually make an impact on the way that the front end works. On the other hand, all of these other channels are available to developers. And that's what I mean when I say that we can have developers that push ahead, but we've been leaving a lot of people behind in the process. We now have a lot of these folks who don't have access to the same tools in these different channels. And that might be a problem, or it might not be, for all of us to think about. But here's the problem, right? Is that today we have a problem of mismatched expectations. Our editors today have come to have a certain amount of expectations about Drupal itself. Like in-place editing, quick edit, is something that many people have come to expect to be part of Drupal in the long run and to be supported well into the future. Also contextual links, being able to look at these options in the context of the front end and being able to administer these things very easily from that perspective as well. And also layout management, for instance. How do you actually deal with layout management in this new world where we have this limit, this kind of threshold that people cannot pass through when it comes to these other channels? Because we can't build all of these for mobile. We can't build all of these for other interfaces. It's just not possible. We just don't have the ability to do so. And so one of the questions I want to ask today is, do we abandon ship? Do we take all of these interfaces that we've gotten used to and just kind of say that this is not something that we should have in the future of Drupal anymore? Is this an expectation that we should get rid of for our users because of the fact that they are too hard to manage and because of the fact that they are very context specific? And as I said earlier, context is very important. But we want to make sure that whatever we build works in multiple contexts and not just the single context that these tools were originally intended for. So there's other questions as well. One of the primary questions I have to ask today also is, how many people are actually the themers that we thought were actually very important to the Drupal landscape? Are there really people who want this kind of idea of theme really easily and not having to do a lot of front-end development? One of the things that we know today, for example, is that getting people who know Twig, getting people who know front-end PHP and Drupal is very hard. Developers are very expensive now to find in terms of the Drupal front end. Or should we double down on that persona? Should we actually provide more of those solutions for people? It's one of the things that I want to ask today to all of you. So there's two different ideas also that I've dealt with over the last year or two that really kind of bring these questions into a different kind of light. And one of those is universal editing, and the other one that I want to introduce today is context-less editing. And both of these have examples right now in Drupal. Universal editing is something that allows for us to administer any kind of interface within the confines of Drupal and also provide that out. About a year ago, I put together a couple of prototypes that are meant to illustrate what this could look like. And I presented this actually once again fairly recently and got a lot of questions. And so I want to actually deal with those critically today and also give you a sense of where my thinking is right now. One of the things that I thought of a year ago and that I really thought would be a great solution a year ago was, what if you could actually use Drupal to do something like this and build a whole chatbot interaction model that allows for you to create a chatbot within the context of Drupal, right? Wouldn't that be an interesting idea? Or what if you could take a machine vision interface that allows for a product to be identifiable on your device and then return content that comes out from that Drupal site and allow you to actually administer what content gets shown in that context of augmented reality? Or, for example, what if you could take something like a beacon and issue a push notification every time someone comes close to that beacon and put some content in there that gives them some kind of a promotion or discount? Now, these ideas are really kind of what I would call interesting for marketers. A lot of the people that I've shown this to on marketing teams are very excited about this idea, right? They think that this is really the future. This is exactly where Drupal should go. But there's a lot of questions, and many of us in the room have a lot of questions about this. This theory of editing everything, of universal editing, revolves around the idea that we can take Drupal and actually edit every channel and create these kinds of applications that we have and these kind of content delivery applications that we have separately from Drupal, but within the context of Drupal itself, namely using APIs and also using outside-in interfaces. And one of the things that that really gives us as a benefit is consistent and seamless user experience. And we also know that people want to have a single tool to make all of these things reality. But we know that outside-in interfaces are really great for some of the things that we want to do in terms of making Drupal much more friendly for users. Usability studies have shown that these kinds of ideas may help users in the long run actually understand better how to edit content within Drupal. And shouldn't we apply this also to other channels and actually allow for users to do things like create these layouts and administer these interfaces that we've built out into the future? But there's a big problem with this, which is that the more channels that we have to maintain for this kind of idea, it becomes a lot more unusable, right? It also becomes something where you have to have a lot more ideas about preview. You have to have a lot more notions of what that means to the user. And we know for a fact that if we want to do something like build a chatbot within Drupal or allow for people to build chatbots within Drupal, that is a big task for us to do. That is a big problem. How do we actually provide a lot of the features that people are used to today in that kind of landscape? So the problem with this idea, and the reason why I've now since gone back from this idea and said to myself, this is no longer something I support, is because there's a problem of over-contextualization here. What we're doing is we're actually putting content even more deeply into its context. We're placing this idea of context completely out and throwing it out of our idea of what the Drupal front end should be. And so this idea of universal editing is interesting, but when we think about the fact that we want to deliver content to channels in this very agnostic way, it becomes very hard for us to imagine that these kind of interfaces could be really successful in the long run. Because the thing that we know is that this idea is great for marketers. People, if you show that kind of a demo to anybody in the room who wants to build a chatbot or wants to build something in Drupal using this, they love it. But we hate that as developers, right? We can't actually, this is a lot of work to maintain and a lot of work to build. And we know that the usefulness is very limited, because what happens when chatbots no longer become the technology of choice? What happens when augmented reality goes into the sunset? And we know this to be true. When we look at the usage patterns of certain modules, we know that certain modules fall out of fashion, and those modules that other people rely on will become less maintained. So a question that I had recently, actually last week, at Drupal Camp Tokyo, was very similar to this problem, which is, wasn't the whole goal of thinking about Drupal as a CMS something that we wanted to do to address the separation of concerns, right? We need to have a separation of concerns between the content and how it's presented. And so don't these interface prototypes that you've just shown actually flout those ideas? And it's true. This kind of idea does flout the separation of concerns. It makes it not really something that we can use easily. But the marketers and the editors and those who are wanting this kind of feature are fighting that kind of idea and that kind of ideal view. But we know that the real kind of sense of having that separation of concerns, the real kind of value of doing this is that we can provide content in a channel agnostic way, in a context-less way. And we actually have this problem where right now Drupal is stuck between a rock and a hard place. We have all these interfaces that we're maintaining. We have all these ideas that we really want for our end users to use. But we don't have the ability to actually have those become something that will work for every single channel. So we're stuck in this problem kind of space right now. Now, one of the things that's interesting, however, is that we have an example of this idea of context-less editing in Drupal itself, which is the traditional node edit form that we're all used to and that we've all seen. That actually takes all of the content out of its context. We don't see that content within the context of the page or within the context of the design interface that we have built for our users. And context-less editing actually enables a different kind of progression. And this is really where I want to drive at today, which is that if we think about these other channels, and we know the fact that all of these kinds of content and this data has to be served out through API responses, if we want to enable these kinds of interfaces for people on the front end, for people who are end users, then we have to actually serve those into SDKs that can then be used by developers to build contextual interfaces. And this is the idea that actually makes this kind of powerful, because we can think about contextual interfaces like in-place editing and things like that. If we want to do TV applications or AR applications or VR applications, we can build those interfaces, but it's something that has to happen after we've provided the underpinnings and the foundations first, and we're not even nearly at that point yet. But what this means is that whereas today we have this idea of having contextual interfaces, right? Layout management, in-place editing, some of these very, very highly contextual administration tools. within that traditional approach, that only works for one channel, and that's the web. But the possible future approach that we can have is by attracting developers to these APIs and attracting developers to these SDKs that we want to build, it could be a very compelling idea for them also to build those kinds of futuristic contextual interfaces that we want to see on those other channels as well. So contextless editing really has to focus on the content rather than the context. Instead of in-place editing, we want to actually decontextualize that editing process and reintroduce that into the node edit form. Instead of contextual links, for example, we want to focus on the content itself and how it's organized, so we have a better view of exactly how the content is structured within Drupal, rather than focusing on the ability to have that be a usable thing. And instead of layout management, we want to focus on actually doing things like sequencing API responses or organizing API responses in a different way, as can already happen right now in Drupal as well. Many people today are using things like paragraphs, for instance, as API responses to create this idea of a sequence pattern. And we have real-world examples of this as well. As I mentioned last year, we built this program called Ask Georgia Gov, which allows for people to ask questions about their government within the context of their Amazon Alexa. But one of the things that's really important to this idea of contextless editing is that we need to have a strong awareness from the editorial standpoint of the advantages of focusing on a channel-agnostic approach. So, for example, Ask Georgia Gov was this tool that we built, and one of the things that we came down to was the stipulation from the customer. And they said, we want to have one single view of our content and one single database for our content. We cannot have multiple versions of content, one for voice and one for the web. So actually, if you look at the Drupal website of Georgia, it's all this text here. We've got FAQs, we've got these topic pages, we've got what you should know sections that are very important to citizens who live in that state. We also have questions and answers in the forms of FAQs. Now, here's the interesting thing about how we built this voice interface, is that as a matter of fact, when you actually go into this interface and you go through the process of asking a question to this Alexa device, it gives you content that has been edited in Drupal. And the content is actually identical. It's the same exact content that's being delivered out. It's just being edited in a different place. And so whereas somebody might use something like in-place editing on the Drupal front end to administer that kind of content, well, what actually makes more sense to that client is to use the content editing tool that's decontextualized from all of that, to actually create this idea of providing content to a variety of different contexts, rather than just having that notion of contextualized editing. And so this process is really interesting because what it actually shows is that this is possible. This is real world. This is actually something that can work. And one of the things that we did for this client is to actually audit their content. We audited their content and we said, what's the content that doesn't work on voice versus the web? And how can we unify that and make that a flattened content approach that allows for us to actually unleash a much more agnostic content strategy that works across multiple channels? And one of the other things that we did is to look at all the links. How can we change these calls to action that don't make sense outside of a website into things that are more contextualized as well? And in the process, we actually decontextualized content, but recontextualized a lot of these links and a lot of these ideas within the page. So all this to say, there's one last thing that I want to end with before I take questions, and that's this notion, which is the fact that, we know that developers expand Drupal's reach. We know that the vast variety of things that we now have available in Drupal are possible today because of developers. And these interfaces that we now build, these experiences that are emerging, are things that are possible just because of developers. And we know, as a matter of fact, that people have built modules and have built interfaces and have built tools and have built things that rely on this Drupal ecosystem. We now have modules that are serving AR/VR interfaces like A-Frame. We now have a Swift SDK, for example, for iOS devices and tvOS and watchOS. We also have a lot of people working on React tooling and Vue.js tooling for Drupal. And this is a very important step in Drupal's history. The thing that I want to end with is that right now we have a very unipolar idea of Drupal. We have this idea that Drupal must be a website, and then everything else is secondary to that. But I actually disagree. I believe that having a more multipolar Drupal, the idea that Drupal serves multiple different needs and multiple different ideas at the same time that are all of equal prestige, that's a really compelling idea and one that we should introduce into our approach. Now here's how the picture looks for editors right now, right? If you think about the fact that the only thing that you can do in a contextual interface right now is limited to Twig-based Drupal sites, and you think about all these other components of our digital ecosystems that we could actually provide contextual interfaces for editors, or provide different tooling for editors to be able to administer content and preview content and experience content in its context, that's actually something that is the next step for Drupal. It's something that will lead to a lot of really beneficial things for Drupal's future. But we also need a new concept of editor enablement. What does it mean to enable our editors? Does it mean educating them? Does it mean actually providing them tools? I argue that it's both. We need to make sure that editors have a notion of what it means to have a content strategy that works for multiple channels. And that means guiding them a little bit away from those in-place editing and contextual tools, and telling them that that's actually less helpful if you want to make the content future-proof. Because one of the things that we could do in the future is to make this possible, where we know that no custom work is required by developers to actually make this a reality. And now, any editor can build these interfaces in a successful way. Now, that's very far in the future, of course. It's not necessarily 6 years from now. But the thing I want to end with is that if we build the APIs, which we are doing today, the JSON API team, the GraphQL team, the Relaxed Web Services team, all of these teams are doing amazing work. And we know that if we build the APIs, the developers will come. Developers are already using Drupal in novel ways. And if we enable developers to build UIs based on those APIs, with SDKs, with Contenta reference builds, and so on and so forth, then we can get those editors to come along too. And we can help them experience the same Drupal that they've always been used to, and just allow them to actually create a lot of different channels. And I want to end also with a quote that, or a conversation that I had with a friend at MidCamp 2 years ago, which is that we have to stop thinking about Drupal as just the CMS. It's not just the CMS, it's the ecosystem. It's every single portion of the ecosystem that we manage and administer in Drupal. Because the thing that we really fundamentally want to do is to expand Drupal's range and provide the ability for Drupal to serve in a very, very robust way all these experiences in exactly the same level of prestige that we give to Twig-based sites today. So the lucky thing is that the API First initiative prepares us for any of those eventualities. And just a couple of notes here, and then I'll take questions. So the question, once again, is who is the Drupal front end for? And how do we make it work for them? In my view, this idea of contextless editing, this idea that we want people to move away from these contextual interfaces, will ultimately win out. And we know that developers support this. The challenge is how do we get the editors to understand this as well? But the thing that we know is that editors and marketing teams, their needs will only grow, and their demands will only grow. So we have to figure out a way to have an approach that enables both developers and editors to continue to have their demands met. So let's enable developers so that they can enable editors. Let's have an API-first orientation, which we have had over the last couple of years, that prepares us for any 2024 event, right? Any sort of, if Web 4.0 is something completely different, or something that doesn't rely on HTML and CSS anymore, we can be prepared for that because of our API-first focus. And from that stability in our API-first initiative and the things that we're doing in APIs, we can then actually expand that range that we offer to editors and make Drupal a much more compelling product for more than just websites. And once again, to emphasize, content should not be something that is context-specific. We know, or context-specific. We know this. And it shouldn't be, oh, sorry, that should say context-specific. But we know that this is something that we should actually focus on as a good best practice. And so let's get back to thinking about content itself and how we can deliver that and not about its context. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Yep, I'll take questions now, and sorry for the rush at the very end there. Just needed to make sure to take questions. Yes?
So you say you want to have content decoupled from the context, but I think in some cases the content should be adapted for the context. If you have, for example, news messages, you want to show them on a website, it's going to be completely different when they show them to digital signage. Because digital signage is going to be like a image, a headline, a little bit of content, while on the website you can show long text. How do you see that evolving?
Yep. So just to repeat the question was, when you think about the fact that a lot of the content that we administer people want that to be specific to the context. For example, showing text in digital signage is going to be different from showing it on the website in terms of messages or notifications, that sort of thing. How do you deal with that? So that's a very interesting question, and that's one of the things that is really challenging right now today, right? Because we know today that our clients want things like, well, I want to be able to see this in a side-by-side preview where I can then change this so that the word goes on to the next line instead of being on one line. It needs to go on to 2 lines, that sort of thing. But this is not something that's easy within that digital signage environment or other environments. We can't actually offer that to our customers until very far into the future. But the thing that I think is important to realize here is that with this idea of having the ability for people to actually see both contexts of that content, right? What that actually does is 2 things. First, it makes the user and the editor realize that they have to make sure that it's impossible to have every single preview of every single place where that text is going to end up. And so they do automatically move towards a more channel agnostic mentality. So, how do we actually, face this issue? Well, one kind of good idea that I think, could surface in the future with some of the thoughts I introduced there at the end is that we can introduce something like an SDK for digital signage that allows for editors to see that in context, but that doesn't force that context to be followed directly or to be adhered to directly in terms of how the editor conceives of that as well. I know that people do want that sort of ability. I think that if we can limit that to something like preview or limit that to something that isn't necessarily so far out that we have to rebuild every tool for digital signage as well, I think that will ultimately lead to a better future in the long run.
But just to follow up quickly, you still need to have your information architecture adapted so you can support all different channels. So you do need to take it into account.
Yes, absolutely. That's why, with information architecture, that's a totally separate consideration, right? And that's a very good point, actually. One of the things that I discussed recently at a talk I gave about conversational design is that, it's something that varies, right? Information architecture on the web is hub and spoke. It's all about kind of a network. Whereas in a conversational interface, it's all about, guided flows and this kind of, one direction down kind of idea. With that in mind, I think that it's something that requires us to think very critically about how we can actually administer that in a way that makes sense for everything. And so, in that sense, perhaps according to your point, maybe that means that Drupal has to become much less focused on a particular way of structuring content for the web, and move into even more of that kind of decoupled idea where content is just this pool that we can draw from, and not necessarily something that is a web-focused information architecture. So that's why I think that the more that we can move a lot of this thinking to the front end, the more that we can have the people who are working on these front ends think about these issues, the presentation layer developers think about these issues, the better off we'll be, I think, in the long run. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Now, the thing that sparked the most interest for me, where I'm really triggered by it, is the fact that you were talking about the recontextualization of, I wrote it on content. the hardest word was recontextualization. Now, I was thinking that's kind of the enabler for all of this to happen, because in order for the website, for the government to ask questions to, the content needed to adapt. And if the content is stale and the content can't change, then that kind of makes all the rest of our efforts into making something better kind of fruitless. So I was thinking, what is the next iteration on the recontextualization of content? Where could we end up? Because if that is the enabler, then we kind of have to iterate on what enables it. Oh.
Yes, and that's a very good point. And that's really the reason why I think that there's 2 components of this that we have to focus on. The first is that, and I think we've been doing perhaps not the best job as the implementers of these interfaces and experiences for those who are customers. And that is that we should really be educating them about the fact that we need to think about this content not within the context of a single channel. We have to move away from that. And they have to think about this in this way. And that takes a lot of education, takes a lot of labor on our parts to help them understand that. And so I think that's a very important first step for us, is to say, let's no longer talk to our customers about, oh, we can just add on a mobile app. We can just add on, a digital sign. We have to help them think about this from the context of, well, how do you want to deliver this content? What's a holistic content strategy, and how does that work for you? But the second thing that you mentioned was, how do we enable these editors to sort of move away in an enforced way, right? And that is a really challenging proposition within the code. And I think that we really have to think about this from the context of helping them understand, as opposed to enforcing this kind of idea in the code. It's something, we know right now, for example, that if we give editors an interface, they will use it wrong. They will use it in a way that we never expected, and it will lead to all sorts of performance issues. I remember there was one case recently where somebody was using they were using a view, but they were making it more and more complex by introducing very kind of esoteric filtering, as opposed to just creating new views displays. It was just the same single views display, but they were kind of using this crazy filtering system that made no sense, and that led to a whole lot of performance issues for them. So I think that we as developers have to take more of that initiative and tell these clients why some of their thinking might not necessarily be appropriate for the environments that they want their content to go to. I don't know if that necessarily answered your whole question.
Yeah. Because I was thinking, let's say you have one text field, you have one text area field. There are 100 different ways where an editor will be able to screw that up. So is there then maybe the way of, instead of just enabling the content to be able to be filled in, is there a way to enable Drupal to help editors in some sort of artificial intelligence way to say, look, you just typed a link and a word next to each other. We don't know what to do with that in 5 different channels.
That's a great idea. Just to repeat for the recording, the comment was, why don't we introduce some kind of help text that's generated, right? Using machine learning to actually encourage the user to think about different ways that their content's going to show up. Like, for example, if someone writes a call to action, for instance, that doesn't make any sense on a voice device, let's notify the user about that. That's a very, very interesting idea, and I'd love to talk about that afterwards. I think that sort of thing is very hard to develop, but it's certainly something that we want to help users understand, is that they have to know that their content's going different places, and what better way to tell them than within the interface itself. So, okay, dankjewel. I'm out of time. I can talk afterwards outside. Thank you. Rush at the end, sorry.